bringing you this meeting in conjunction with our friends and comrades at Stop the War. My name is Christine Blower, and I will be chairing the first part of the meeting, and then I will then hand over to the General Secretary of Liberation, Roger McKenzie, who will chair the Q&A. We've got lots of really interesting speakers, but even though they've got lots and lots to say, I'm going to ask them just to speak for 7 minutes so that we can get everybody in, please. And with nothing more from me, let's go first to our first speaker, who is Steve Bell from the Stop the War Coalition. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. The British government has supported the war on Yemen since its start. In 2015, the then Defence Secretary, Philip Hammond, stated that the British government would support the Saudi coalition, quote, in every practical way short of engaging in combat, unquote. Since then, the British government has enthusiastically endorsed the Saudi coalition's siege and war on the poorest Arab majority nation. It began by providing intelligence, arms, aircraft, and logistical support. It has placed military and British aerospace personnel in the Saudi command center in Riyadh. It has trained coalition members' personnel from their armies, navies, and air forces. It has placed troops inside Saudi Arabia on missile batteries. It has placed troops inside the Al-Qaeda airport in Mahra inside Yemen to aid militias in the south. Alongside this, it offered political and diplomatic support. It argued against the establishment of an independent investigation into war crimes by the coalition. It supported an absolutely one-sided UN Security Council resolution in 2015. In its subsequent position as UN penholder for Yemen, it refused to promote an alternative political resolution for Yemen. Even as President Biden dabbled in applying pressure by temporarily suspending some arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the British government insisted on maintaining all sales. As the former colonial power in Yemen, Britain was evicted in 1967 from Aden and South Yemen by a popular uprising. Perhaps the depth of British government belligerence towards Yemen is nothing but the historic grudge of affronted white supremacy. Certainly, there is no benefit for the majority of people in Britain from the destruction of Yemen. In cities like Cardiff, South Shields, Liverpool, Sheffield, London, Birmingham, and elsewhere, Yemenis represent the longest standing Muslim and Arab communities. In the past 2 years, young Yemenis from the cities have led the peace movement in demanding an end to the siege and war on Yemen. As yet, our bipartisan parliament is not listening to young Yemenis, nor is our parliament drawing any lessons from 7 years of failed policy. Martin Griffiths, UN representative for Humanitarian Affairs, gave testimony to the UN Security Council a few days ago on March the 15th. He stated that 23.4 million Yemenis require some form of assistance. 19 million of these will go hungry, an increase of 20% over last year. He also drew attention to the fact that while food prices nearly doubled in Yemen last year, they will get worse, as Yemen imports a third of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. The British government is aware of these facts, but it still believes that the Saudi and Emirati dictatorships are waging a just invasion and occupation of Yemen. In its defense, the British government likes to boast of its humanitarian concern for Yemen, a trait it shares with the US government. The UK government has given £1,087 million in humanitarian aid to Yemen from 2015 to 2021. In the same period, it has licensed the sale of at least £22 billion in arms sales to the coalition. This self-proclaimed humanitarianism involves trading 20 times over in weapons of mass destruction compared to instruments to alleviate human suffering. Nor is this improved. The US pledging event for Yemen on March the 16th was asked to raise $4.27 billion for 2022. It received commitments from governments for just $1.3 billion. This is a similar shortfall to last year when millions of Yemenis had Russians halved or withdrawn. Clearly, if the war is to continue, it will do so with completely inadequate relief programs. In the last year, Biden has abandoned attempts to change the course of the Saudi regime. His preoccupation with pursuing the new Cold War against China and Russia has given US allies in the Gulf more weight. The Conservative government in Britain is relieved. It wants to maintain its arms sales and trade deals with the royal oligarchs in the Gulf Cooperation Council. It also wants to play the role of US's heavily armed puppy.
I hope you're winding up now, Steve.
We recently witnessed an extraordinary spectacle. The Saudi and Emirati regimes are reported to have refused a call from Biden to increase oil production. With his tongue hanging out, Boris Johnson took a personal trip to the Gulf asking for increased oil production. Mohammed bin Salman turned him down flat. This was humiliation. Unfortunately, the official opposition in Parliament, Keir Starmer's Labour Party, is being entirely silent while Biden has made his U-turn. It then falls to the popular movement to step up opposition to war. The war remains committed to national and international action to end the war. We call for an immediate lifting of the siege, an end to arms sales to the coalition, and an inclusive political process for the Yemeni people. We thank Liberation for their hosting and contribution today to end bridge complicity in the siege and war on Yemen.
Steve, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for excellent opening. Okay, we move now rapidly to Mahmood Al-Sagheer, who is the president of the Yemeni Community Organization in Germany. And I hope we've got, yep. Yes. The floor is yours, Mahmood. We're very pleased to have you with us.
Grace, you need to unmute.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
I don't think
you can't hear it. I don't know why. 1 sec. Can you hear it? No? Okay, maybe we'll have to come back to it.
Okay, we'll move to our next speaker, Grace. Thank you very much. And we'll try and come back to Mahmood once we've sorted out that technical issue. Our next speaker is is it sorted? No.
I don't know. Somebody said they can hear it, but let's.
I couldn't hear it, but let's move to our next speaker, and then we'll see if we can hear Mahmood after that. So our next speaker then will be Professor Madawi al-Rasheed, who is a visiting professor at the Middle East Centre of the London School of Economics. I've got enormously long notes about all of the academic background to Professor Madawi al-Rasheed, but for the sake of not using up too much time, I'm going to say that she's written several books, including articles in academic journals on the Arabian Peninsula, Arab migration, globalization, gender and religious transnationalism. And she's also a visiting research professor at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me in this important discussion. There are three issues that I would like to raise. Why this particular war that is launched by Saudi Arabia and why it has taken 7 years. And finally, the third one is what we can do to stop it. On the first point, why this war? First of all, just to put all this in context and say that Saudi Arabia has been interfering in Yemeni politics throughout the 20th century. The first war that took place was in 1934, and their disputed territories that Saudi Arabia annexed and made it part of Saudi Arabia, and the Yemenis had always wanted it back. Other reasons for Saudi interference in Yemen throughout the 20th century and up to this point is that Yemen is the most populous country in the Arabian Peninsula. It's on the southern border of Saudi Arabia. And although Yemen was not fortunate enough to develop its political system to have a real democracy, it did have a strong civil society. It had political parties, it had elections, and yes, it was governed by Ali Abdullah Saleh for several decades and turned it into a dictatorship. But this doesn't change the fact that Saudi Arabia worries about Yemen having the rudimentary institutions of democracy. Yemen has a strong society and a weak state, and this has been the situation throughout the last 100 years. But Saudi Arabia always wanted a weak Yemen, a Yemen that is fragmented and divided, and it has always interfered in the domestic politics of Yemen through sponsoring tribal groups or sponsoring the leadership, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and playing one group against the other, simply because Saudi Arabia is scared of Yemen, although Yemen is the poorest Arab country at the moment. So this is the general sort of point that the Saudis adopt and the general narrative, a weak, fragmented, and divided Yemen. Now, let me just move very quickly to 2015 and why King Salman appointed his son, Mohammed bin Salman, as Crown Prince and also Minister of Defense. Mohammed bin Salman wanted to establish his credentials as an unknown young man and thought that this war on Yemen will be quick, swift, and it will crown him as the desert warrior, like his previous cousin in the 1990s, who claimed that he won the Gulf War when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and Saudi Arabia invited 500,000 Western troops, mainly American troops, to liberate Kuwait. So he wanted to establish his credentials. The second thing that Mohammed bin Salman wanted was to have Yemen as a training ground for a Saudi army and air force that had not actually had the experience of combat. It had accumulated so much weapons and fighter jets and and training that had come primarily from the United States and from Britain, as Britain is the second country that supplies Saudi Arabia. It's the highest, second on the list. So Mohammed bin Salman wanted to see if the amount of weapons that he had accumulated and his predecessors are actually working, if they are in the hands of the Saudi army or military forces. So these are the reasons for Mohammed bin Salman to launch this war. There is a third one, and that is the claim to protect the southern borders of Saudi Arabia from Iranian expansion in the Arab world. And they didn't want a Hezbollah type of organization and military group on their southern border. So containing Iran and protecting Saudi Arabia. And the stated objective that we all heard was to return the Yemeni president, which is in the Saudi narrative, is the legitimate leader of Yemen, Hadi, to Sana'a after it was taken by the Houthis. So this is the sort of a combination of stated objectives under UN sanctions and approval by the US and Britain and other countries. But there are also the latent reasons for this war to be launched. So I move to very quickly to my second point about why it has taken 7 years. At the beginning of the war in March 2015, King Salman and his son belittled the Houthis and said that they are a bunch of thugs and they are going to finish them in a quick and swift war. I think most dictators think of war as very quick and they could score a victory and move on. But obviously this hasn't happened. So why hasn't Mohammed bin Salman, with all the weapons and the training that the Saudi defense forces had received from Britain, from the US and other countries, not scored that victory? There are three also reasons why. One of them is Mohammed bin Salman has the war continues simply because Mohammed bin Salman has unchecked power at home. He is not constrained by members of his own family, other royalty, who in the past had dealt with the Yemeni file, such as, for example, deceased Minister of Defense, Prince Sultan. It wasn't the prerogative of the king to deal with Yemen, but there was a sort of division of labor within the Saudi royal family, and the Yemeni file was held by one prince. Now Mohammed bin Salman controls every aspect, every institution of the state, the defense, the economy, the crown prince office, etc. And there are no other royalty that could put a brake on his ambition. So that's one of the domestic reasons. The second one is Saudi Arabia, as you know, is a dictatorship. Society is completely disenfranchised. There are no institutions, no political representation, no elected government, and no civil society. So since 2015, no debate was allowed about this war inside Saudi Arabia, and it was seen as a remote conflict that doesn't affect people's lives in the main urban centers where most Saudis live. But we have seen recently, only like a day ago, that Jeddah, the port on the western side of Saudi Arabia, had been hit by Houthi missiles. So the war had been remote, away from everybody, and in the absence of any kind of grassroots activism and debate about it, it continues without anybody able to contribute to the conversation about it and the futility of this war. In fact, it's a war that is impossible to win. And Mohammed bin Salman, unfortunately, didn't understand that or anticipate that. So that finally, and most importantly, the war enters its 8th year because there are arms supplies that continue to flow into Saudi Arabia. It's an opportunity for Western government, mainly US, Britain, France, and many others, in addition now to recently to missiles and equipment bought from China and other countries. In addition to also mercenaries who are brought to Saudi Arabia to fight this war, mainly from Sudan, from even as far as Central and South America. We know that the UAE has used Colombians in order to fight this war. Saudi Arabia has relied heavily on Senegalese and Sudanese soldiers to fight it. So as long as the international community, and specifically the countries that supply Saudi Arabia with training, directing its fighter jets and its missiles into Yemen, it is not gonna stop. And I'm just going to say just a second about what we could do. I think we, as active citizens, we need to keep the pressure on those governments that supply Saudi Arabia with arms, mainly Britain. If we're talking about Britain, we really need to put up the pressure on Boris Johnson. And as Stephen mentioned, you know, he was the second highest leader to visit Saudi Arabia since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist, in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. President Macron of France visited Saudi Arabia before the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, and this was followed by Boris Johnson. Up to now, President Biden refuses to sort of give Mohammed bin Salman an audience, shake hands with him, and he is, the relationship has not been great. But Mohammed bin Salman remains defiant, as we see in his various interviews that he's given to Western media. When he was asked about his relationship with President Biden, he said he doesn't understand, and frankly, I don't care. And this crisis, the energy crisis that the whole world is going through, has emboldened him, has empowered him, because he knows that he holds the keys to the oil wells. However, these oil wells are now under threat by missiles, and the fires are burning in the western part of Saudi Arabia. The second, in addition to pressurizing the governments of these countries, what we need to do is also step up the pressure on cultural, art, and sporting activities that had rewarded Mohammed bin Salman by holding events, concerts, and races in the country. So in addition to the political pressure, we need to also reach out to all those cultural and sporting partners and make them endorse a boycott of Mohammed bin Salman, because simply by going there, holding events, they are saying that we don't care about his human rights records inside the country and his ongoing war in Yemen. Thank you.
Chris Hazzard, Sinn Fein MP, who was elected in 2017, the first Sinn Fein member to hold the particular seat of South Down. But of course, as most of us know, due to the abstentionist position, Chris doesn't take his seat in Westminster. So we only see him in committee meetings rather than in the chamber. Chris, the floor is yours.
Christine, thank you very much. And can I start tonight just by saying that I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in this event by Liberation and Stop the War. It's an honour to extend Sinn Féin's steadfast solidarity in support of the people of Yemen, but also to reiterate our continued opposition to the Saudi-led military campaign. The callous and indiscriminate Saudi aerial bombardment in particular has been both brutal and undoubtedly illegal in international terms. Away from the gaze of the Western world, nearly 400,000 people have died as a result of this war, including at least 10,000 children. You know, such an horrific and unjustifiable slaughter of innocents. The Saudi regime has also enforced a criminal blockade, which prevents vital aid from reaching the Yemeni people. Indeed, I noticed recently that the UN have warned that a child dies every 10 minutes as a result of this blockade. You know, thousands more have been injured and bereaved by the indiscriminate bombing of civilian homes and hospitals, schools, and factories. You know, and as a result, Yemen is facing unprecedented socioeconomic crises, culminating in what most experts consider is the greatest humanitarian crisis of this century. You know, Stephen has outlined it well, and the professor before me, but 2 out of every 3 Yemenis live in extreme poverty, which we've learned in recent days has been worsened by the Ukraine war. You know, the country relies heavily on Ukrainian food imports, and indeed, as been reminded here tonight, over 1/3 of Yemen's wheat is imported from Ukraine. So, you know, in recent weeks, the UN have warned us that there's 14 million people now in urgent need of food assistance, with nearly 8 million men, women and children at risk of dying from urgent famine. You know, it's a matter of moral responsibility, of human decency and compassion, of international solidarity, and of life and death that we support the people of Yemen urgently. You know, as a party, Sinn Fein have for some time now called for an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia. We've pushed both the British government and the EU on this matter. Certainly with regards to Britain, if the British government wished to posture in the international stage and present itself as a guardian of basic rights and democracy, and I know many people will laugh at that suggestion here in this particular call, but that work must begin at home. You know, the British government's endorsement of the brutal Saudi dictatorship is inexcusable. It's a state which stands as, you know, one of the worst human rights abusers on the planet, and they have to immediately cease their complicity in deepening the conflict and furthering death and destruction through their sales of arms to Saudi Arabia, including, most urgently, the unacceptable sale of British-made cluster munitions. You know, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which was adopted in Dublin in 2008 and signed by 120 countries, explicitly bans the use of such cluster munitions, but it also commits all signatories to work to prevent their use by anybody else. You know, when cluster bombs pose a particular risk to children who are often attracted by their toy-like appearance and their bright colours. My party colleagues in Dublin have repeatedly appealed for the Irish Minister of Foreign Affairs to raise these issues with the British and Saudi counterparts, and to inform them that the people of Ireland are totally opposed to Saudi Arabia's use of cluster bombs and their ongoing war in Yemen. Indeed, just on Wednesday in the Irish Parliament, my party colleague, Senator Paul Gavin, challenged the Irish government for their failure and deliberate refusal to speak out forcefully against the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia and the terror inflicted upon the people of Yemen. The Dublin government need to take a leading role in calling for a global arms embargo. It needs to use its much vaunted seat at the UN Security Council to call for an end to this war. The shameful silence of our government in Dublin, just like the government in Britain, is inexcusable. Its repeated reluctance to condemn the Saudi dictatorship or even call for an investigation into blatant war crimes begs the question of why Dublin even sought a seat in the UN Security Council in the first place. Only 2 weeks ago, the Irish government sent a Minister of State to Saudi Arabia to tout for business. This is at a time when the regime was just preparing to engage in a series of executions, which we have seen. The worst was 81 executions in one single day. The Saudis are no friends of democracy, civil rights, or indeed human decency. Rather than looking for investors in Saudi Arabia, we continue to call on the Irish government to significantly increase humanitarian aid to Yemen and to closely monitor the ability of such aid to reach those people most in need. In recent weeks, we've seen what is possible, thankfully, in terms of tackling Putin's invasion and the horrendous actions of Russia in the Ukraine. It's hugely depressing and frustrating, however, that a similar popular response is not forthcoming in reaction to ongoing Saudi crimes in the Yemen. For my part, and for my party's part, we will not hesitate to condemn a dictatorship responsible for what is the worst disaster and humanitarian conflict in the world right now. So, Christine, just to finish, I want to extend our continued solidarity to everybody here in the call tonight and calling for an end to this conflict and for a lasting, negotiated and settled peace. Solidarity with the people of Yemen. We must stop this war. Solidarity now and always.
We can always rely on Chris to come and make a brilliant intervention when solidarity is needed. So thank you very much for being with us today. We now move to Kirsten, who is going to speak to us from the Campaigns Against the Arms Trade. She's been a regular speaker, and prior to joining that, she prior to working with the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, she worked at the university in. She was a university lecturer and she was deputy leader of Reading Council. So, Kirsten, over to you.
Hi, Christine, thank you. And thank you to Liberation and for Stop the War for this great event. Really glad to be here. I'm going to talk about three things, really. The first thing to talk about is the fact that Yemen is a rolling disaster. It's a present problem that, although the war has been going for 7 years, it's still a live issue. I'm going to talk about the UK's complicity in that war, and we've touched on this a little bit. We'll say a bit more. I'm also going to talk about how the Saudis are attempting to dodge accountability for their actions in this war, and what we can do to make sure that they are held accountable for what they're doing. So the first thing to say is, last Wednesday, the United Nations were gathering together a group of potential donors in Geneva, and they were looking for £4.3 billion of aid to cover the needs of something like 17.2 million people in Yemen. The truth is that while they were asking for 4.3 billion, what they got was 1.3 billion. So there's currently a huge humanitarian need coming up and a big gap to fill. And I think we need to understand where that humanitarian need has come from. It's come from the bombing and the war that's taking place in Yemen. Yemen Data Project, which is a local project, and I'll drop the link in the chat after I finish speaking, has tracked something like just under 25,000 air raids on Yemen, which has killed just under 9,000 people directly and injured another 10,000. And the UN last year highlighted that 377,000 people have been killed in the war as a result of the bombing in terms of humanitarian need. So it's an ongoing issue. It continues to happen. But even worse than that, Yemen Data Project says that the number of bombings this year compared to the previous 2 years is up fourfold. And we need to understand why that is. The Saudi government lobbied really hard to remove a UN type of accountability called the Globe. It's the group of eminent experts, essentially inspectors going in to see what they were doing. And as soon as that group was disbanded, the bombing started to pick up again after having been comparatively low, so a fourfold increase. And what they're attacking is they're attacking communications masts. They're attacking the way that people track their crimes. So it's pretty clear that what they're trying to do is to trying to get themselves out of this terrible position that they have put themselves in, and the people of Yemen, by bombing more ferociously, bombing the systems that keep them accountable, and working through the UN to neuter its accountability mechanisms. Meanwhile, our own governments turn their back on providing aid to Yemen, and instead, Boris Johnson goes to Saudi Arabia. You also find that Priti Patel was at the same time hosting a Saudi delegation down in Farnborough at the Security and Policing Arms Fair to provide them with the latest technology to track dissidents and campaigners, the same dissidents and campaigners, by the way, that they've been executing this week, that week and the week before. And we also found at the DSCI Arms Fair in September of last year that Ben Wallace was actually giving the Saudi delegation a guided tour of the arms fair and was photographed doing it. So the concept that this government will be holding the Saudis to account is not going to happen. And the idea that the Saudis are going to hold themselves to account when there's not international pressure on it, again, is clearly false. So we, in fact, as citizens and as people, need to encourage our politicians to do better, and we need to intervene. So certainly at CAT, we've been encouraging people to lobby their MP, of course. We've certainly, our activists have been taking direct action, both at the arms fairs, but also at arms companies, to try and, if you like, slow the war machine. And the other thing that we've been pushing for is legal accountability. So we took the government to court 2 years ago, and in fact, the government was forced to stop issuing new arms licenses. It decided unilaterally to restart them a year later, and we're taking them to court again this year. So sort of three-pronged type of pressure, if you like: lobbying MPs, citizen action, legal pressure. And also our colleagues over at the European Centre for the Constitution and Human Rights are suing the arms companies in the International Criminal Court, as well as civil servants, to make them accountable for the war crimes that are taking place. So we must hold the Saudi government accountable, we must hold the arms companies accountable, and we must hold our own politicians accountable. But I would echo Chris's sentiment as to wrap up, which is to say that in the end, this holding of people accountable for their complicity in these crimes is only part of the story. We must continue to extend our solidarity to each other, to the people of Yemen, and to everybody who's caught up in these terrible conflicts that are driven by war, driven by the desire to control resources, to control people, and to use violence to do it. And so, if I can leave you with the same message that Chris left you with, solidarity is actually how we solve this thing, and everything else is just a tactic. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kirsten. Very good presentation, I must say. Okay, our next speaker is Shireen Al-Adeimi, who is a peace activist and scholar, and of great interest to me is the fact that she's an assistant professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Teacher Education. So there's much more to be said about her, but for brevity's sake, I'm going to just give the floor now to Shireen. Shireen?
Thank you, Christine, and thank you all so much for being here and for the speakers for shedding such important light and giving incredible background about this war that has completely devastated Yemen for the past 7 years. 7 years ago today, Saudi Arabia and the UAE began bombing my country of birth, Yemen. And I want to remind people that the announcement for this campaign, which was dubbed Operation Decisive Storm, was announced by the Saudi ambassador to the US at the time during a Washington, DC press conference, not in Arabic, but in English. Immediately, the Obama-Biden administration announced its full support for the Saudi-UAE campaign, including weapon sales, intelligence, logistical support, and what they called the establishment of a, quote, joint planning cell with Saudi Arabia. Within months, the war was turned into the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and not only because of the bombing, but also because of the land, aerial, and naval blockade that has continued ever since in the name of preventing Iranian weapons from entering the country. The bombing was described early on by a leaked UN report as targeting civilians in a widespread and systematic manner. These include targeting homes, infrastructure, food facilities, agriculture, and even school buses, weddings, and funerals. To date, at least 377,000 civilians have been killed. The blockade, on the other hand, has prevented fuel from entering the country, thereby shutting down essential needs such as hospitals. Half the country cannot access healthcare at all, while the other half are met with hospitals that are barely functioning at 10% capacity. Currently, a child dies of starvation every 75 seconds. And I encourage you to watch this painful yet incredibly powerful film called Hunger Ward if you want a snapshot into the horrors of child starvation and the heroic Yemeni healthcare workers trying to save their lives. And as you watch, I'd like you to remember that these kids are the ones lucky enough to find a hospital, while millions more around the country are starving and cannot access any healthcare. The other impact of the blockade involves preventing trade, which destroyed Yemen's economy, given that Yemen used to import 90% of its food needs prior to the war. Without imports and trade, 80% of Yemenis have been forced to depend on international aid, and even aid was used as a weapon of war, with Saudi and UAE continuously repeatedly failing to fulfill their pledges to the UN World Food Program to cover the costs of starvation that they themselves have created in Yemen. And with the Trump administration going as far as cutting USAID to northern Yemen, where 70% of the population resides. President Biden, who is now the third US president to carry on the war against Yemen, is also threatening to place the Houthis on the list of foreign terrorists, which would entirely starve 70% of the Yemeni population. These war crimes continue to be perpetrated against the Yemeni people unchecked and with impunity. The Yemeni revolution began in 2011 and is sometimes described as a failed revolution. I would argue that the revolution has not failed, but that Yemeni civilians have certainly paid the price for demanding a democratic state free from dictatorship, free from intervention. And it's not up to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or the US to determine what's best for Yemen's future. It's up to the Yemeni population to choose their own course, and that's what we should all be demanding. So let's work to end our government's complicity in war crimes in Yemen. Like Trump, Boris Johnson has not promised to end UK support for the war in Yemen and has committed to support his Saudi and UAE allies. But here in the US, President Biden did in fact promise to end US complicity in the war, going as far as saying that he will end offensive operations in the war in Yemen. Unfortunately, this has been nothing but a rebranding of the war. While he introduced this dichotomy of defensive versus offensive weapons and intelligence and logistical support, I want to remind folks that all support for the war in Yemen is offensive. The blockade on Yemen is offensive. Choosing targets to help the Saudi and UAE coalition target sources is offensive. Training pilots is offensive. Providing maintenance and spare parts to their aircraft is offensive. Our governments are not defending US and UK territory by bombing Yemeni children. Our governments have helped create the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and it's up to us to hold them in check. You and I have 30 million reasons to end our government's complicity in the war in Yemen. There are 30 million Yemeni men, women, and children waiting for their lives to resume. And as we speak, my relatives in the city of Hodeidah are going through yet another round of bombardment, which the press is often, unfortunately, continuing to frame as retaliatory. There is nothing retaliatory about this war. It's not a war. It's not a civil war. It's not even a war. So if you're in the US, please call for Congress to pass the War Powers Act to force President Biden to end his offensive war in Yemen. Please also call attention to weapon manufacturers like Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin, and others who've made hundreds of billions of dollars from this war and whose bombs we continuously see with the serial numbers posted right on them. And if you're in the UK, please also hold your elected officials accountable for war crimes against Yemenis and hold weapon manufacturers like Bay Systems accountable. And don't let people forget what these bombs do to civilians in Yemen. Thank you always for your continued solidarity, and may the people of Yemen live in peace, free from intervention, free from invasion, and free from blockade. Thank you very much.
Shireen, thank you very much indeed. We will certainly remember the 30 million reasons. That's an extremely well-made point. I believe we can now move to the presentation from Mahmood Al-Sagheer, and then we will go to Jeremy Corbyn. But I believe the presentation from Mahmood is now available. Yes, Grace?
Yes, it should work this time. So guys, let's try.
Perfect.
Hello, my name is Mahmood and I'm from Yemen. I was there. 7 years ago, I was there. At 1 o'clock in the morning of March 26, 2015, Saudi Arabia, led by the coalition, started the war in Yemen. It was the first airstrikes that bombed Yemen, and later thousands of civilian areas. 7 years ago, I was there. I was in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. I saw with my eyes airstrikes targeted civilians directly in different places in different times. Those airstrikes led to hundreds of Yemeni people's death. Many victims were children and women. 7 years ago, I was there. I am witness to the siege of the Yemeni people when they closed the international ports, including Sana'a airport, and preventing millions of Yemenis from their rights to have freedom of movement by the US-backed Saudi aggression coalition. 7 years ago, started a war in Yemen, just like what Putin did 1 month ago in Ukraine. The difference is that the international community, its institutions, and countries such as America and the European Union allowed Saudi Arabia to violate Yemen, which is also a member state of the United Nations like Ukraine, and turn a blind eye to killing civilians and targeting infrastructures. King Salman is just like Putin, but he got the green light from United Nations and United States and European Union to go further in destroying Yemen and continuing the massacres of the Yemeni people. The dire humanitarian situation in Yemen is an entirely man-made catastrophe. Exactly 7 years ago, the US-backed Saudi coalition began a series of war crimes and crimes against humanity that targeted the Yemeni people everywhere. Homes, streets, hospitals, schools, and even wedding and funeral halls. The United States supported the Saudi government in the war. Even the war resolution issued in Washington. They provided the coalition with bomb and arms deals and international support through the Security Council and United Nations institution and media blackouts. According to the United Nations official reports, in Yemen, every 9 minutes, a child under 5 years dead because of war. In Yemen, 8.6 million people pushed into undernutrition. 1/3 of population, which means 13 million people, are only a step away from a famine. Till now, the 7 years war was responsible for 400,000 deaths, directly through bombardment and hostilities, and or indirectly by causing the worst contemporary humanitarian disaster. The Saudi-backed coalition of aggression is preventing the entry of food commodities and basic materials such as cooking gas and petroleum derivatives, and increasing the suffering of the Yemeni people. The Saudi-backed coalition of aggression is besieging the Yemeni people by land, sea, and air, and preventing critical humanitarian cases from leaving Yemen to receive treatment or provide a haven far from the war. Because of all of these unfortunate facts, let's say it loud and clear: stop war on Yemen. For the children of Yemen who were victims of a war and have nothing to do with it, stop war on Yemen. For the children of Yemen whose schools and homes were bombed, who lost their families, stop war in Yemen. To stop the suffering of an entire nation that has the right to live like all human beings. Stop war on Yemen. What we could do to stop war in Yemen: demanding the lifting of the blockade on all Yemeni land, sea, airports, and the urgent delivery of humanitarian aid to the people who are suffering from starvation. We must expose the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Yemen in the media. We must demand that all countries and individuals involved in war crimes in Yemen be prosecuted and referred to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The demand to stop the export of weapons to the countries of the Saudi coalition that are used directly to kill the Yemeni people. All governments that are silent and inactive on the Yemeni issue must be confronted. Unfortunately, the end of the war does not mean the end of the tragedy in Yemen. At each home, there are victims who we won't forget, and wounded who will carry their wounds to the future as a witness of the crimes of the Saudi aggression. The sacrifices of our people to defend the homeland will remain in the memory of every Yemeni. We have mercy on every martyr and victim during the 7 years of the sake of Yemen. 7 years ago, I was there, and after 7 years, war still there. And I'm here to say clearly, stop war on Yemen. Stop war on Yemen. Thank you.
We thank Mahmood very much for that presentation, and I'm so pleased that we managed to make that technology work. I'm now going to extremely briefly introduce our next speaker, who is our last speaker, and I'm then going to hand over to Roger McKenzie, who will chair the second part of the meeting. Our last speaker, as ever at a Liberation meeting, is of course a long-serving MP for Islington North, former leader of the Labour Party, and the current chair of the Central Council of Liberation, Jeremy Corbyn, whom I hope is here, but I haven't seen him.
Christine, yes, thank you. I'm here.
Hello, Jeremy. Thank you very much. I've got to go now, but I'm leaving you in the capable hands of Roger McKenzie.
They are very capable hands indeed, and I'm very happy to do that. Christine, thanks very much, and lovely to see you, and thanks for chairing it.
See you again soon. Bye.
Okay. Roger, are you wanting to say something first?
No, mate, you fire away. I'll come in after you.
Well, thanks, Roger, and thanks everyone. I caught the last last two contributions to the meeting, and so I hope I'm not repeating things that have already been said. Just to put the Yemen war in its context, it's now gone on since 2015, as others have said, exactly 7 years. And during that time, there have been tens of thousands of casualties. 20 million people are in need of food support, and the country is being routinely bombed by Saudi Arabia, which is very generously supplied with a very large amount of weaponry from Britain and other countries, and the UAE are also involved. So this coalition that is bombing Saudi Arabia is well supplied with weaponry from Britain and other countries. And that is brought about, obviously, destruction and the worst humanitarian disaster anywhere in the world. Large numbers of refugees, mainly fleeing to neighboring countries, and no obvious end in sight. And so you have to ask yourself the question, what is behind all this, other than a demand by many that the 30,000 million barrels of oil that are in reserves in Yemen be made available for other people to exploit, or it's part of a proxy war between Iran and other countries. There has been no serious attempt to bring about a peace movement and a ceasefire, despite Britain being the pen holder of the UN Security Council resolution on this. No action has been taken in that respect, and no effective sanctions have been taken at all against Saudi Arabia for its activities. And indeed, the missile that hit the oil facility outside the capital of Saudi Arabia yesterday, which briefly disrupted the practice sessions for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, got more publicity than all the refugees and all the deaths and all the food shortage and all the other things put together. So you have to ask yourself some questions about where the priorities are in this. Now, the US has to some extent been under pressure from the Congress to reduce arms supplies to Saudi Arabia. The British government has been put under some pressure to reduce arms supplies, and we put in our election manifesto that we would halt all arms supplies to Saudi Arabia because of the war in Yemen. And I absolutely hold to and believe in that position, and we should continue doing it. But there's also the question of refugees. So I'll just share this thought with you for a minute. I totally and absolutely condemn the war in Ukraine. I totally condemn what Russia has done, the invasion, the attempted occupation, the civilian targets, and the huge numbers of refugees that are now flowing out of Ukraine and looking for somewhere to go safely. And they must be made welcome wherever they can end up, and be able to lead useful lives and hopefully one day return home. The same open door facility has not been offered by any European country to victims of the war in Yemen, or for that matter, the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Syria. It's a very, very different story where they're concerned. And so I think the first demand all of us in the peace and anti-war movement must make is that Yemeni refugees should have exactly the same rights as the best rights any other refugee has. They are victims of war. Secondly, that we absolutely halt all arms supplies to Saudi Arabia straight away, as of now, and the technology that goes with them. And that that halting of arms supplies would then be a way of adding more pressure on for an urgent ceasefire to be achieved, and the country not be occupied either by the proxy forces of the USA or the proxy forces of anybody else, but the people of Yemen have some ability to decide their own future, because this war is going to kill a lot more people. A lot more are going to die from cholera, a lot more are going to die from starvation. And even the UN appeals, and there have been quite a few, for humanitarian aid for Yemen have not met the targets that are necessary simply to keep people alive. And so we are under the management of governments in our own countries that seem indifferent at best to all of this, or put the relationship with Saudi Arabia at such a high level that there cannot be anything but continued supply of arms to Saudi Arabia. One of Saudi Arabia's main allies, the UAE, in all this, and part of the bombing campaign, part of the coalition of forces that's bombing Saudi Arabia, has recently signed an accord with Israel, as have a number of other countries. And I believe there is a factor in that the sharing of technology, of weaponry and so on will make the situation worse in Yemen than it is, even worse in Yemen than it is at the present time. However, slightly optimistically, in the fallout of the war in Ukraine, the interesting thing is that the Western governments, particularly the United States and most of the European governments, have suddenly realized that if they're not going to buy gas, oil, or other minerals from Russia because of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia because of the war in Ukraine, then they're going to have to get, in the short term, oil from somewhere else. We can't go completely over to renewables and sustainable energy all in 6 months. It just doesn't work like that. It will take years to move away from the high dependency on oil. And so suddenly the US is starting talks with Venezuela and with Iran. Now, I hope that in these talks that take place with Iran, I hope we revisit the Iran nuclear deal, and that will bring about a lifting of the sanctions against Iran and a human rights dialogue with Iran. I also hope that this will lead to an urgent ceasefire in Yemen, so that there can be a process by which the people of Yemen decide their own future, their own form of governance, and the relationship with neighboring countries. And so holding this meeting tonight on Yemen, 7 years on from the start of the war, is very, very important. Important because it's not getting the publicity it deserves. Important because it's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, as described by the United Nations. And important because the longer the war goes on, more children are going to die, more hospitals be destroyed, more schools destroyed, more agricultural areas destroyed, and the living standards of those that survive this will continue to fall. And at some point, following the complete collapse of the Yemeni economy and society, others will go in and exploit the natural resources that are there. It's brutal beyond belief. It is unnecessary. And it's a war that is a showcase for weaponry that will be on display at arms fairs around the world, as used by Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others in Yemen. It's cynical, it's bad, and it's wrong. Let's build up a big campaign. Ceasefire now, process for peace, which will bring about a decision of the people of Yemen, and above all, an agreement with Iran and other countries, which will begin to ease the dangers of yet more wars in the Middle East, because The world can't afford to carry on killing each other like this. And the only beneficiaries of this are the arms manufacturers who are pumping the weaponry into the region. No more a weapons showcase in Yemen. Peace for the future, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. As always, to the point. Before I open it up to questions, comrades, can I just introduce myself properly? I'm Roger McKenzie. I'm General Secretary of Liberation. I'm also a reporter with the Morning Star newspaper. So first two things are adverts. Firstly, if you are not a member of Liberation, then please join and encourage others to join. Actually, there's three adverts. The second advert is if you already don't donate and contribute and support Stop the War Coalition, then please make sure that you do as well. It is really vital that in the face of the sort of attacks that Stop the War Coalition are receiving at the moment, that we give our maximum support. We must all organise and campaign for peace. We must all campaign against wars everywhere, and we are delighted at Liberation that we're able to do this meeting this evening jointly with the Stop the War Coalition. The third thing that I wanted to say by way of advert is to ask you to subscribe to the Morning Star newspaper. If you are not a subscriber to the Morning Star, you're missing out big time. Not just on my writing, but on writers far, far better than me. And it is an organising tool for our movement. It is one of the places where issues like Yemen is continually discussed. Unlike most parts of the media that have ignored Yemen for years, and that is not something that the Morning Star newspaper has done. So we need your support for the only socialist English language daily newspaper in the world. With that, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I've been getting quite vexed about the selective compassion that there seems to be around the world at the moment. Understandably and quite rightly, people need to have compassion for people fleeing the Russian invasion. This war has been going on for 7 years, but you wouldn't have known it, frankly. You simply wouldn't have known it, other than by reading the Morning Star or listening to Stop the War Coalition or reading what we put out from Liberation. You simply wouldn't know that 7 years of mass destruction has been taking place of the Yemeni community. And I just think that's wrong. I just think that it's unacceptable for there to be levels of compassion, for there to be levels of concern about wars. There are 40 wars going on across this globe, at least 40 wars. And we should be concerned about all of them, frankly, all of them. One of the things that I always remember that Jeremy said at the brilliant Stop the War Coalition rally that took place in Conway Hall recently. And Jeremy said that at the end of all conflicts, the leaders of nations will always sit down and make an agreement of some kind. They'll sit down, they'll write an agreement. But aside from that, there are millions of displaced people in the world, millions of displaced people because of those conflicts. And there will be millions of people who will have an anger about what's happened to their families, to their communities, to their homes. And those don't go away really quickly. The length of time that it takes to sign a piece of paper, it takes far, far longer for the pain, the hurt to go away that people have experienced. And that pain and hurt has been going on for 7 years in this conflict. But as we heard at the beginning of this meeting, there's been interference in Yemen for much longer than that, for the whole, frankly, of the 20th century. So we've got to really get our acts together as activists, as people who are concerned, to make sure that this war stops. And that's really been the theme of the discussion this evening. But I just want to add one more thing, and that's about why this selective compassion. Well, I think we can't rule out, as some people have done when I talk about this, they rule out, oh, this can't possibly be anything to do with racism. And frankly, I've had that all my life, where people tell me this can't possibly be to do with racism when you raise issues of racism. And I think we have to treat this seriously, that when people say that they are being treated differently in Yemen from anywhere else, including in terms of what they're entitled to as refugees, when the whole language in the UK is changed so that people from Ukraine are ostensibly talked about as evacuees now and not really refugees, then I think we have to call it out for what it is. And I don't think we should be shy about it. I think we should be upfront and clear about our condemnation of double standards. So those are my few words. We're going to go to some questions. We've had a few questions in, and I'm going to try and just group a few of these together. There's a couple of themes that have come out of some of them. One of them, and I'm putting this to any of the speakers who want to kind of contribute, the speakers that have spoken so far. I will give a little bit of a chance later on, if you've got time, for other brief contributions from other participants as well. But one of the themes that's come out from a few questions, and indeed was raised in a couple of the contributions, was about sporting boycotts. We've got the Newcastle United, owned by Saudis, I think. Certainly people involved. We've got Saudi Grand Prix tomorrow, I think. We've got World Cup. You know, Saudis are qualified for the World Cup, apparently. I'm being told, Barry tells me. What is our position, folks, on those sorts of sanctions, those sorts of boycotts? What are the views of the speakers? Jeremy, do you want to come in first?
Thanks, Roger. I couldn't agree more with what you've just said in your introduction about the gradation of compassion. As you say, the war in Yemen's gone on 7 years, and most of our media have hardly reported it at all. And when I tried to introduce an opposition motion to suspend all arms supplies to Saudi Arabia, the lobbyists went into hyperdrive on MPs. A lot of pressure was put on MPs about jobs associated with arms production and the Al-Adeimi arms deal with Saudi Arabia. And the biggest rebellion I ever faced within the Parliamentary Labour Party was over arms to Saudi Arabia, which I wanted to stop sending there at all. So the pressure is absolutely huge. The specific point about the sports boycott, Lewis Hamilton, to his absolute credit, and Sebastian Vettel, to his credit also, have both spoken out about human rights abuses in Abu Dhabi, but also in Saudi Arabia. And Lewis made a very strong statement saying he didn't want to be there, he'd rather not be racing there, and he was shocked at human rights abuses. And then there was a very, after the attack on the oil facility, there was a meeting with Formula One last night. A very interesting BBC report on it said that Formula One drivers agreed to go ahead with the race tomorrow. Sounds very reluctantly, because there was apparently a meeting for 4 hours about it. And they eventually agreed to go ahead on the basis of assurances received. But there was also a very interesting uncommented upon fact reporting that it had been said that the Formula One teams would have difficulty removing their cars and equipment from Saudi Arabia if the race didn't go ahead. Now, I don't know what all of that means, but I think it's a very odd thing to put in the middle of a report. And so I just think the sports wash that goes on has to be challenged. And whilst whether Saudi Arabia hosts a tennis tournament, a golf tournament, a Formula One race, football match, or whatever, isn't necessarily going to be the one thing that changes the human rights record of the regime, it starts to build up a picture. And that is important. The sports boycott did not end apartheid in South Africa. The fact we didn't play cricket or rugby with South Africa and they were banned from football and other tournaments did not of itself end apartheid. But it certainly aided the concentration of a lot of people in South Africa as to why their country could not take part in international sporting activities. And so I think sports wash, which is what Formula One race is all about, has to be challenged. And that's why I sent this social media message out last night in support of what Lewis Hamilton said. And so, yes, let's go for a sports boycott, a cultural boycott, and so on. But it not of itself, it won't be the whole story. It's arms sales that are absolutely critical to the whole thing.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to bring Shireen in maybe for a comment on that, and then I'm going to maybe touch a bit more on the arms stuff and come to Kirsten after that. Shireen.
Sure. I agree with everything that's been said so far. I do think that any kind of boycott, and whether it's in sports or, I mean, there's no way to not get Saudi oil. But if there's a way to boycott Saudi products, I personally have, boycotted even visiting the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And I think all of this is important. But I struggle with this question because I'm sitting here in the United States and I'm paying taxes and I live in a democratic country. And my country is just as responsible for bombing Yemen as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so here's the struggle. The people of Saudi Arabia haven't chosen their government. The dictators get to decide what's going on there. They get to bomb Yemeni civilians with impunity. Here in the West, in the UK, in the US, we continue electing people into office who continue bombarding Yemeni civilians. The war in Yemen cannot continue to this scale without without US and UK weapons, without US and UK intelligence, without their training, without their logistical support, without intelligence, without diplomatic cover. And so we are just as complicit as these Saudi and UAE regimes. And I do encourage people to really think of that as well, while we're also boycotting goods and sporting activities and all of these events that are taking place in Saudi and the UAE.
Thanks, Shireen. So if I can come to you, Kirsten, because one of the kind of central kind of parts of the discussion, I think quite rightly this evening, has been about the role of the arms trade, really, in all of this. So, I mean, what do you think? What is it practically that we can do? I mean, in your presentation, you made some suggestions about the kind of three kind of things that we can do. What is it that people on this call could practically go away and do to try and influence the arms trade, close down the arms trade, I think?
Well, there are, of course, a number of things that people can do depending on their circumstance. If they live near an arms factory, or if they live near an arms trade event, such as the arms dealers dinner that was taking place this week, I would encourage them to organize against those events, try and get inside, try and disrupt them. Anything that the arms companies are doing is likely to be something that we would like to stop. And certainly in the case of BAE Systems, they're hugely complicit in the war. tend to realise that there's been something like 23 billion pounds worth of weapons sold to Saudi Arabia during this war, and the vast majority of those have come from BAE Systems. So targeting arms companies or focusing campaigns on arms companies certainly can help. But I would certainly say that that's only got to be part of the story. I think the other part is, in the end, we're in a democracy. We need democratic accountability. Direct action is brilliant, but it needs to be tied into insisting that our democratic representatives step up. And Jeremy highlighted just how disappointing it was that so many Labour MPs were, and let's be honest about it, they were nobbled by BAE Systems. Yeah, it was obvious what was going on. And some of the other companies as well, but especially BAE Systems. So I think we as campaigners and as citizens, we need to be as effective as the corporate lobbyists, because unlike the corporate lobbyists, we actually vote for and support our MPs, assuming that the party is one that we support. So I think for me that is the other part of it. And absolutely, if people got a few pennies to contribute to whatever legal cases are going on, love it. But I think definitely taking action against arms companies, lobbying your MPs, two really quick actions that people could do.
Thanks, Kirsten. Is there? I mean, just a question. I mean, in terms of those the legal cases, is there a crowdfunding kind of effort for that, or is there a way of people being able to contribute towards those cases?
At the moment, the CATS case is currently funded. There's structures around this kind of thing. So right at the moment, we're for the next steps we have funds. The International Criminal Court, really, International Criminal Court need to actually pick up the prosecution, pick up the allegations that actually prosecute. So there's not much to be doing there. But I think definitely keep an eye, because, as I say, the legal route has to be a part of what we do. As campaigners as well. And again, crowdfunding has helped get us where we are in terms of the legal case, and it may well come up again as we go into the next stages.
Thanks, Kirsten. Steve, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just to refer to the earlier discussion about sports washing. Shortly before Christmas, Stop the War supported a demonstration outside the Premier League, which was originally organised by Yemenis and Bahrainis. People probably know. Bahrain itself was invaded by Yemen in 2011 when there was a people's uprising there. So we joined Bahrainis and Yemenis who organised the meeting to protest that Saudi Arabia is not the responsible owner for Newcastle United. I think the value of such actions is not that they will shake the world, but that they are popular issues which one can have a certain impact upon. I think the need for stepping up our campaigning in general, whether it is around particular issues or just simply organising local activities where you invite someone from the Yemeni community, invite someone like Madawi al-Rasheed. Madawi is a Saudi exile. You have to understand the incredible courage of the Saudi exiles in standing up to the Saudi regime. We need to hear their story. They're opposing this war, and it's not a small thing. So we can organize local meetings and should be doing that to put pressure upon our local politicians as well as the national politicians, because unfortunately, there is very little pressure upon British politicians at the moment, and that's our responsibility. That is what we have to turn around.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, one of the things that kind of strikes me from this is that certainly we need to put pressure on politicians, and each of us have a role in terms of our kind of local activity. But there's a couple of questions come through that raise another part of our movement that we need to look at how we can get them involved, and that is, of course, the trade union movement. So I mean, maybe begin with you, Jeremy. I mean, what about the role of the trade union movement in the campaign against the arms trade, but also just in terms of Yemen and raising the issues of Yemen as an important conflict that we need to pay attention to, and of course the refugees from Yemen as well. You're still on mute, Jeremy.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah. Raising the issue at a policy level with anyone with any decent sense of humanity is not difficult. People see the connection. Arms sales leads to deaths. And I see Kirsten nodding the head at this point in agreement. Where it becomes more complicated is on the role of BAE Systems, particularly because they're the largest company by a long way, on sales to Saudi Arabia. And it's a huge amount of money involved. And there are obviously jobs involved in that. And so it is a question of engaging with economic development and economic policies and union policies on an arms conversion strategy as well. Britain spends 2% of GDP on defense expenditure. A lot of that is actually spent in the United States on procurement from there, but a considerable amount is here, particularly to BAE Systems. And there has to be a conversion into making other things. Now, I've always found in discussion with those that manufacture weaponry of any sort, be it sort of guided missiles all the way through, they're not usually very comfortable with what they make because they realize what can happen to it and what it can be used for. But they're also stuck in a bind of what's the alternative for them. And they are often very, very skilled people. If we had a proper development of a sustainable green industrial revolution, of a green economy, those are absolutely the jobs you'd need. Absolutely the jobs you need in transport, in building, and in so much else. And also the need for aircraft and ship production, which is for peaceful purposes, not for wars. And so that is the pressure we have to put on. But I tell you this, that the arms companies are not just innocent providers of equipment waiting for a call from the Ministry of Defence to ring them up and say, we really do need X, Y, and Z. Can you provide it for us? They are actually lobbying the whole time about the perceptions of security or insecurity, the perceptions of the dangers of what this war is about. And it is claimed that this is a war against extremism. I can't think of anything more extreme than bombing a hospital or bombing a school or bombing somebody's home. But it's presented in that way. And so that in turn leads to very high levels of arms expenditure, both in this country and in Saudi Arabia, in by BAE Systems, and also in United Arab Emirates and other countries as well. So it is two levels. One is the immediate argument, the war in Yemen has got to stop. Not supplying Saudi Arabia wouldn't stop it immediately, but if Saudi Arabia had a loss of supply of weapons, it would make a very big difference. And if Saudi Arabia thought it was going to become economically isolated from the rest of the world, that would make a very big difference indeed, because they are very hooked on buying weaponry and selling oil, neither of which, in my view, are particularly sustainable things to do in the very long term. So it is about engaging people, and it's good that Liberation Stop the War and have organized an event like this today. That is absolutely excellent in having that discussion. There isn't enough public debate and public discussion about it. And in a perverse kind of way, the horrors of the war in Ukraine have begun to waken people up to what wars lead to. Massive flows of refugees and massive death toll of civilians. Sadly, it has gone on for 7 years in Yemen with barely any reporting at all. And as I keep saying, the UN itself says it's the worst humanitarian crisis anywhere in the world. It's not caused by an earthquake, a volcano, a tsunami, a forest fire or anything else. It's caused quite deliberately and specifically by bombing with the weapons that we supply.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to call in the other speakers, but in case anyone's wondering why I've not called in Chris or Madawi, it's because they've had to leave us early to go to other engagements. So in case you think I'm being rude and I'm not inviting other people in, it's not the case at all. I wouldn't do that. Maybe Shireen, do you want to chip in? And then Kirsten, and then Steve.
The question is about what to do to get organized. I mean, there's just so much we can do. There are things that you can continuously write about to your local paper, organizations and efforts, you know, at weapon manufacturers, protests like I've seen in the UK and I've seen in the US that have been very successful. Even if there's, I mean, it's just so sad, the limited media attention that Yemen receives, that any kind of action that gets media attention is important and is significant. I'm hearing today, actually, as we're speaking, that the Houthis have announced a unilateral 3-day cease in the fighting. And so this is good news. And I hope that we can continue to amplify efforts toward peace in Yemen, whether it's through social media or through writing to our local papers or to going out in the streets and protesting. Again, there's just nothing worse in the world than what's going on in Yemen. And like Jeremy said, not because it's some natural disaster, it's because our governments have chosen to support this entirely useless war of hubris and aggression in Yemen. So I think nothing is too small or too large, given how little attention this war gets.
Kirsten.
I think it does come back to industrial policy. I remember doing part of a study on how dependent some areas were in terms of dependency on the arms trade, and places like Barrow-in-Furness, which is up in the northwest, which is where the nuclear submarines are being made. The argument could be made that the entire economy of that town is dependent on the arms industry. You can, the jobs and the calculations you have for direct jobs and indirect jobs suggests that is true, which is, it was really hard to see, but of course is true. But I think Jeremy's point is absolutely right. In the end, there is paid work to do, or paying work to do, in terms of the green revolution. But we need to change our thinking. We need to understand that security doesn't come from military force, and it doesn't come from, if you like, and taking action is not just sending your troops or your aircraft in. It is also actually thinking about climate change. It's thinking about healthcare. It's thinking about social provision. Our security as individuals comes from those things, whereas what we often get is the narrative from the states that we're in, whether the US or the UK, of what makes them secure, which is undoubtedly weapons, and it undoubtedly is the use of force. So I would suggest that changing how we think about security is really important. And I'm going to highlight a partner organization called Rethinking Security, who have some good thoughts on that, who are doing a lot of work in terms of sitting down with people and saying to people in their communities, okay, what worries you? What makes you feel secure? Because changing that narrative then changes our politics, and changing our politics is actually what we need to do.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. Steve?
I agree with Shireen. No action too small or too large should be set aside. Whatever we do, it will make a contribution towards the movement to end this war. We are all part of a network, whether it is our family, our faith community, our union, our political party or community organization. Take the discussion and take the issues into those networks and organize. We have to step up our work around this, because 7 years is too long, and we are now in the 8th year. We've begun the 8th year now. This has got to be the year when we bring it to an end. I'm sure Liberation has certainly Stop the War's National Office will provide you with materials and assistance in any activity that you want to engage in around this. And there are plenty of speakers who can educate the people who are interested, who want to get active on this question. Together we can make a difference, so let's make that difference.
Thanks, Steve. I know that sometimes it feels as though there's just so much going on. It's just so difficult, and it's just too much, basically. But I think one of the things that I've learned from history is that nothing changes unless we make it change as working class people. Basically, we have to do the organising. We have to be the ones to make the difference. The line that I always say in my speeches, so as I'm not giving a speech, and I'm just going to say it in this bit of the meeting anyway, is that we are the ones that we've been waiting for. There isn't anybody else who's going to kind of do this for us. It's always been down to us. So if we want to see the end to wars, it's going to have to be us again, who make the case and go out into communities, go out into workplaces, convince people that peace is the way, that those people who want to attack CND and want to attack Stop the War, for standing up against war in Ukraine and war everywhere else, that we have to be the ones to go out and make those arguments and say that that these people are right to stand up for peace, and people will always try and deflect us, won't they? Because they always do. They always say we're wrong, we're we're giving power to Putin or whatever. We just have to keep arguing for peace, I think, because I think it is really the only way. I want to, I don't know if Chris Nynham can hear me, but I wanted to give Chris the opportunity maybe to say something about the teaching today, because I think one of the things that we can do is learn from each other. And I mean, I wasn't able to get there today, but I understand it was a really well attended event and some brilliant speakers. And I just think the more of those sorts of events that we can do to learn from each other, exchange ideas about what we can practically do, not just a talking shop, but things that we can do from these meetings, seems to me to be a worthwhile thing to do. So, Chris, are you able just to give us maybe a bit of an update from today's teaching?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks very much, Roger. And thanks to Liberation for co-hosting or for having the initial idea for putting on this meeting as well. And I think it's, it's been a great meeting and very, very interesting. Thanks to all the speakers. Clearly, this is a central issue. It's something we've been campaigning on for a long time, since the very beginning of the war. And in a way, as some of the contributors have said, it has a very important place now, because it is something that is being completely forgotten, completely suppressed in the mainstream at a time when the whole of the world's attention is focused on another war with a different dynamic. And so it's very, very important, not just because of the anniversary, but because of that, and because of the importance of the issue itself, that we carry on campaigning over the issue of Yemen. We had a kind of teaching event this afternoon about the war in Ukraine, but we talked about Yemen as well. We talked about the record of the West and NATO more generally in it as part of the discussion. And obviously, it was very well attended. It was very encouraging that there were so many people who came along. And I mean, I obviously can't describe all the discussions. We had a whole range of speakers from, we had Vijay Prashad was there. We had speakers from Ukraine and from Russia, and a British-Ukrainian speaker as well as a whole number of others. And, we kind of developed the analysis and developed the arguments we've been putting, essentially that we called from the start for an end to the Russian invasion, which is obviously causing an absolute catastrophe in the country, in Ukraine. And And from that also talked about the role that NATO and the West is playing, and how it's not enough just to call for the withdrawal of the Russian troops, essential though that is. We actually have to look at the wider context. And one of the things about the immense coverage that is going on in the mainstream about this issue is that it's completely free from any discussion about context or cause or history. And we're trying to rectify that really and put it in context and show that the eastward expansion of NATO over the last 30 years has played a very, very important role. And that essentially the misfortune and the tragedy of Ukraine is that it lies on a fault line between the NATO and the West, and mainly US's sort of power play on the one hand, and on the other hand, Russia's attempt to reassert itself as a major power in the region, and that context is really absolutely essential to understanding how what is going on in Ukraine. So that was really what went on. We'll be putting out all the sessions on video shortly, so people can watch at their leisure. The final thing, the most important thing in many ways, obviously, is that we have to carry on campaigning over this. And I think a lot of people felt that we need to carry on protesting, campaigning, that we should have more demonstrations. We had a very respectable demonstration a few weeks ago with the slogans of Russian troops out, no to NATO expansion, which was very important. I think we need to keep in the streets and keep campaigning. And just finally, I think there's a feeling that despite the kind of collective amnesia in the mainstream, amongst the politicians, on the Labour front bench as well, about NATO's role, you can actually win the argument because people remember the disasters of Afghanistan, they remember the disasters of Iraq, they remember the disasters of Syria and of Libya. And many people do actually know about what's going on in Yemen as well. And so on that basis, we can move forward and we can build a growing minority, at least, of people who understand the situation and are campaigning against this war. So that's really the prospect going forward, that we're going to ramp up the campaign. We're having meetings all around the country on this issue, and we're going to continue to link the issue to the other wars that the West is fighting, including the war in Yemen.
Thanks, Chris. And for me, that is one of the things that I hope that we can do as well, is have more discussions across the UK about Yemen. I haven't spoken to my colleagues in Liberation about this, but that's what I hope that we're going to be doing after this meeting. I think it would be a shame just to have one meeting and think that, and hope that does the trick. I think we need to sponsor more discussion and more activity across the country. So that's what we'll be looking to do. What I'm planning to do now, folks, is that I've had a specific question for Shireen, which I'm going to read out for her, but then I'm going to give each of the other speakers an opportunity for 2 or 3 minutes just to kind of wind up final comments, and then I'm going to do a kind of wind up to the meeting, if that's okay with everybody. So I've been sent this one, Shireen, and asked to read this out for you. I asked my member of Congress whether he would co-sponsor a bill about stopping arms sales to Saudi Arabia over Yemen. He replied this, quote, "About 6 months ago, Oxfam Mercy Corps and 4 other NGOs pursuing peace in Yemen wrote a letter asking Congress not to pass any more legislation aimed at restricting Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They felt at funding the Shia, mostly Houthis, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE funding the Sunnis, we do not provide any offensive weapons to either country and ended refueling and intelligence sharing several years ago. How should I respond?
These are the blatant lies that we continuously face in our work here in the US. We are working with people who are supposed to be our allies that we then discover are working against us and our causes. This is big business, unfortunately, even for aid organizations. And so they don't have an incentive to stop aid to Yemen. Now, the truth is that Congress actually, there was a letter led by Congressman DeFazio in the summer that asked President Biden to clarify the position of what is offensive and what is defensive. What is offensive? How are you defining this? What does it mean when you say you've ended offensive intelligence? What does it mean when you've ended offensive operations? And they actually just ignored them for a while. And then when they did respond, DeFazio said this was a non-response. So they really did not answer that question. So for any member of Congress to say that, oh, we've definitively ended offensive or operations in Yemen, whether it's intelligence or otherwise, it's just not true. The administration has not responded to them in any way that clarifies its position. Refueling ended under the Trump administration, not the Biden administration. And the US continues to supply arms and provide maintenance and spare parts. The planes cannot continue to operate in Yemen, Saudi planes, without maintenance and spare parts. And after every single flight, we have US contractors on the ground in Saudi Arabia providing maintenance to their aircraft and providing these spare parts. To the degree that we actually just heard yesterday from Congressman DeFazio and Jayapal that they are asking President Biden to end all forms of support, or they're threatening another war powers resolution. They keep pushing this back, of course, they've announced it a month ago, but we do have certain members of Congress who understand that the US is still involved. And I think there's there are some within Congress who want to believe President Biden, who want to believe that, his promises to end the war, but that has not materialized. He has not been clear. And we know we have lots of evidence that it's just a rebranding of the war and a continuation of what we saw during the Obama and the Trump administration. So we really should be pushing back against this narrative. And it's really disappointing to hear that some within Congress continue to share this view, and that some within the ally community are working against our efforts to end US support for the war.
Thank you, Shireen. Really appreciate that. And then I'm going to ask Kirsten, Steve, and then Jeremy for some final comments. Kirsten?
Yeah, I would say you could probably do something every day to resist the war in Yemen. Into the chat, I've dropped a couple of links to Mwatana, who are a human rights group based in the country, and also the Yemen Data Project, where you can find out what's actually going on from people who are living it and who can see what's happening. And as I say, if you follow ourselves, CAT, or if you follow Stop the War Coalition, or a number of peace groups have been standing in solidarity with Yemen today, so you can see them all on the Twitter. Keep getting the word out. Keep just every day, just do something. Check what's happening with the casualty figures. See what the latest report is. Write to your MP. Look at the ICC, or as I say, climb over the fence at Wharton and try and stop the plane taking off with all the weekly flights for the components. Whatever it is you've got the energy to do, we can all do something every day to just make that little bit of a difference, because in the end, it's a lot of little differences that will actually add up to a big difference, and that's what we need with the war in Yemen.
Thanks, Kirsten. Appreciate it. Steve?
Yeah, just 2 points I want to make. Firstly, this is an asymmetric war. The idea that there's some equal or balance is completely untrue. British politicians are trying to convince us that Saudi Arabia is under some terrible and consistent attack and needs to be defended. A Saudi spokesperson in December last year, just a few months ago, said that their estimate was the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, have launched 430 missiles, 851 drones since the start of the war, killing 59 civilians. Terrible things, any civilian death. But it works out at one attack a day, right? That's it. In comparison, we are talking about the Saudis with one of the most sophisticated air forces in the Middle East, overwhelmingly supplied by Britain and the United States, which have conducted 24,000 air raids. Each air raid will involve probably a number of planes and a number of separate strikes, because that's the way they define an air raid. And tens of thousands of civilians have been killed by those. So this is not a balanced war. And the other thing is you have to grasp, and what must outrage us and make us motivated to act is the extraordinary hypocrisy of the British government. The Yemen funding conference, Britain committed to £89.3 million this year towards Yemen. That is less than half towards humanitarian aid that Britain was contributing as recently as 2020, less than half. Meanwhile, you have the Britain's ambassador to the UN can get up and talk at the UN about the need to address Yemen's funding and say things like, and this is a quote, the United Kingdom calls on all donors, including those in the region, to step up. Now that is the conventional hypocrisy of British intervention and British foreign policy. They are asking others to step up to address the humanitarian crisis while they are fueling it by supplying weapons and supporting the siege of Yemen, and not even meeting their own criteria to step up, because that 89 million is more or less what they paid last year, despite the worsening of the humanitarian crisis. They're not going to do it. We have to get on and press them.
Thanks, Steve. And Jeremy.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks everyone for being on the meeting. It's lovely to see Ray Street at the meeting, and the comment she put in about media reporting and the role of the Morning Star in making sure that we actually understand something about the Yemen is important. And I just wonder if you made the point earlier, Roger, that there were 40 wars going on around the world. It'd be sort of quite interesting if a paper, the Morning Star would be ideal, of course, could do a sort of weekly summary of all 40 of the wars, just a line or two on each one. So we'll begin to understand the totality of what's going on in the world. Because if I walk down my street now and said, what wars are going on in the world, everyone would say Ukraine. Yeah. I'm not sure how many of them would talk about any other conflict. Some might talk about Yemen, but not very many. And it's just understanding that. And then you begin to understand the size of the arms trade and the money that it makes. And I think it was Glenda who put a very good question in about the arms sales for defensive purposes only, because that is what the law says in Britain, and there is the quadripartite committee on arms sales in the House of Commons, and I have struggled with them on various occasions about selling weaponry to various countries, Saudi Arabia, of course, Israel and others. And it's always worth pursuing that. And I know the legal action that Kat did was very, very important and very powerful in this. And so the point that Kirsten was making about all actions help something in the totality of it. The legal action itself isn't going to stop the war. The sports boycott of itself isn't going to stop the war, but the totality of all these things begins to make a massive difference. And the last point is, because really at the heart of all this is Britain's relationship with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. That is fundamental to the whole question of the war. Fundamental is the issue of oil purchases from Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure what that noise is. It's either a whistle or a cat, I'm not sure. It's absolutely not my cat. It's very quiet at the moment. but it's absolutely fundamental to so much, and that is about fossil fuel dependency, which is beginning to change. Hello.
Can everybody go on to mute, please, if you're not Jeremy Corbyn or me? Thank you. Go on, Jeremy.
Okay, and so it is about dependency on fossil fuels, but it's also about the incredible power of the arms trade lobbying and the great work done by Andrew Feinstein, who was a South African MP, about the power of arms lobbying. It's very important to get that sort of message across. But the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia also needs examining. 80 people executed in one day, a further 20 executed on the day that Boris Johnson was going there to talk about them lowering the price of oil on the spot markets around the world. And so it goes on. Well, I just asked myself the question, if you're serious about human rights, would you really be happily trading with a country that executes such a large number of people by beheading them? I mean, any form of execution is wrong in my view. Obviously, this is particularly gruesome, what is going on there. And so we need to do the campaigning, explain what is happening, support Yemeni refugees and Yemeni people and the Yemeni exile community in Britain that often feel they're completely forgotten and completely ignored. And so that's why I started with this initial idea about how we might start to do something which will help us to understand the totality of wars around the world. Because having the meeting today is obviously very good and very important, and I'm very pleased we've had it, but it is not enough. We've got to do far, far more than that. And I'm glad that Stop the War had the teaching today on the wars as a whole. It was impossible for me to be there, but that teaching was, I understand, a very successful one. We've got to get that message out there. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for being on this call tonight. And thank you for caring.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming along, Shireen and Steve, all of our speakers, Kirsten, thank you so much. I know the great work that Campaign Against the Arms Trade does as well. And I know we cover that a lot in the Morning Star as well. Can I also thank people who behind the scenes have done some great work to make sure that this meeting took place. And by the way, somebody tried to sabotage this meeting from taking place. So absolute congratulations to everybody who's been on this call for even getting on this call, because we had to change the arrangements at the absolute last minute. So thank you so much for being that. So can I thank Grace, Tarina, Tom Gill, Reggie Thomas, Payam, and Jamshed, of course, for all the work to make sure that this meeting took place. And obviously, can I thank everybody who's given up their time on a lovely day in the UK to come along to this meeting. None of these meetings really matter if we just come to the meeting and just think we've been to a meeting and that's it. And the most important thing now I'd suggest to everybody is what we do as a result of this meeting. And hopefully that means going away and organising and engaging with people about the war in Yemen and making sure that the Saudi and the UAE governments are actually held to account for what they are doing. They are massacring people. I think it was Shireen right at the early part of the meeting who said this wasn't a war. It wasn't a civil war, it wasn't a war. This was an absolute massacre that is taking place. And I think we have to remember that. And the only way these things end is by our activity, by our engagement, and making sure we build the movement that's big enough and strong enough to make sure that people hear and make sure that people take the steps that are necessary to stop this conflict. I can see Jeremy waving his hand at me, and I've learned in 30 years that when he does that I'm to listen. So Jeremy.
Just a quick point, sorry to interrupt you, Roger.
Okay, go on.
I'm agreeing with what you're saying. We need to have serious discussion and debate about the arms trade and arms conversion. I've been talking to Andrew and a number of other people about how we can develop this. It's not about threatening people's jobs. It's about using those skills to produce something else. If you approach the whole thing from the point of view you're against people that produce arms, you're not going to get a hearing from anybody. They've got to live. So it is a question of a serious alternative being prepared and produced, and a government that is prepared to fund that change and guarantee the jobs on the changeover process. It's just, we need further discussion on that.
No, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. The final thing I'll say is I think Jeremy's idea to do a regular update or a regular log, if you like, of what's going on in the conflicts around the world, I think that's a really good one. I'll put that to my colleagues at the paper if they don't do it, which I'm sure they will actually, but I'll write something about it anyway. And we can do something on a regular basis about that, because I do think it's important. There's a lot of people around the world who are just forgotten, who just don't think that, you know, who feel that they're unimportant, because frankly, to some people, they are unimportant. And I think we have to make sure that they understand that they're not forgotten by us, and that we stand by them in the solidarity that's been expressed so many times during this meeting this evening. So, comrades, can I thank you all so much for coming to this meeting. Remember to support Stop the War Coalition. Remember to support Liberation. Remember to subscribe every day to the Morning Star paper, but most of all, go out and organise, and let's build our peace movement. Thanks, comrades. Take care. Stay safe, everyone.